Have you ever imagined a child living in absolute silence, where every sound is punished and light seems like an enemy? This is not fiction. It takes place in reality, with a young girl trapped in darkness, estranged from the world and from people. When she is discovered, the world looks on as a test of science, language, thought, and human resilience. But what happens when those tasked with saving her become the ones who hold the key to her survival between love observation and invisible experiments? This girl, who has been silent for over a decade, begins to rediscover the world through words, gestures, and laughter, but also faces insurmountable barriers. In today's video, we step inside her life, where tragedy, science, and survival intersect, and where silence sometimes speaks louder than any words. In 1970, a nearly blind mother mistakenly walked into a welfare office in Los Angeles. Beside her sat a 13-year-old girl, silent, frail, moving like a frightened animal. And from that seemingly small mistake began to unfold one of the most harrowing cases in American history. A child raised in darkness, tied to a chair, forbidden to speak, studied by scientists, and ultimately abandoned by the very systems that promised to protect her. You're watching Sleepy History Tales. Tell us in the comments where you're watching and what time it is for you. If you want to walk through this chilling history with us, like and subscribe, because tonight, the case we open isn't just about what one child endured, but what was lost forever. On the morning of November 4, 1970, Irene Y. hesitantly entered the Los Angeles County Welfare Office. She was nearly blind, her eyes clouded by untreated cataracts. She had gotten lost looking for the department that processed disability benefits, but instead walked into a branch that handled regular welfare applications. Beside her was her daughter, a small figure Irene introduced as 13. But what the workers saw that day was not that of a normal teenager. Her body told its own story before a word was spoken. She was so thin, they mistook her for 6 or 7. At 13, she weighed only 59 pounds. She was hunched over her shoulders, hunched forward, her head bowed as if to ward off light. Her steps were heavy, slow, hunched like a creature unaccustomed to open spaces. Her hands were stiff, clenched close to her chest, the posture of someone who wanted to run away rather than come closer. Her clothes were dirty, ill-fitting, not enough to cover her body in the early November cold. Her face was haggard, her eyes lifeless, drool running down her chin. When the clerk's employee called, she did not respond. Her mouth opened only to make broken, shapeless sounds of language. The sounds seemed suppressed, reluctant, as if each noise might invite punishment. She avoided eye contact, glancing briefly and then back again, never holding a normal look for long. Her silence was pervasive, filling the room with a stillness. The caseworkers had seen 1,001 difficult cases, known poverty, neglect, bruises hidden under clothing, but never a body so frozen. This was not the scene of a case intake. It was like opening a long-forgotten room. Within hours, the authorities were called. Doctors at Children's Hospital Los Angeles prepared for an emergency admission. The police followed them to the house, and the first look at the bedroom confirmed all suspicions. Windows covered with foil blocking the light, a narrow cage made of chicken wire, and the characteristic stench of confinement. But all that evidence came later. The first alarm sounded as the girl stood silently beside her mother. At the hospital, medical staff weighed, observed, and recorded. Her body was stunted. Her teeth were crooked due to malnutrition. Her limbs were weak and she had difficulty maintaining her balance. She had little control over her movements and her ability to control herself was almost non-existent. She could not speak. She was 13 years old, but her life was hanging in the balance. Journalists would later use only one word to describe her feral, but that word hid the human context. She was no creature of the jungle. She was a child born without any knowledge of the world. No language, no play, no ordinary human speech marked her early years. What the staff witnessed was not wild instinct, but an engineered silence, the product of deliberate design. That morning, no one had yet known the depth of her captivity or the layers of tragedy hidden in her family's past. They saw before them only a girl caught between childhood and something nameless, a presence haunted by the absence of all familiarity. Questions about language, about development, about the nature of cruelty remained dormant in unopened files. It had begun not with an investigation but with a misdirection. A blind woman following habit rather than light walked into the wrong office. Clark's staff took a closer look, and in that chance encounter, one of the most horrifying cases of child abuse in American history came to light. The haunting truth still resonates. If Irene Y. had chosen a different hallway, the girl known as Genie might never have been seen. When doctors at Children's Hospital Los Angeles first examined her, they found her body a living archive of deprivation. She stood before them not as a typical teenager, but as a figure whose every line bore the marks of years of confinement. At 13, she weighed less than 59 pounds. Her frame was that of a child half her age. Her growth had not just slowed, it seemed frozen. Her gait was the first clue. She moved with a hunched posture, knees bent, arms raised awkwardly, feet sliding forward in small, awkward steps. Observers compared the trot to that of a startled rabbit still tethered to the ground. This was not how a child learned to walk. This is how the body adapts when it is not given space to move. Muscles atrophied from immobility, joints stiffened from years of confinement. On closer inspection, the doctors found other evidence. Her teeth were crooked and missing, the result of poor diet and neglect. Saliva constantly dripped from her lips, soaking the front of her shirt. She had not learned to swallow rhythmically when she spoke because there were no words to practice. The nurses noted that she was almost mute. She made short animal sounds, ungrammatical syllables, as if language had never been allowed to exist. Her eyes told a different story. Her vision only worked within a narrow range, about 12 feet. Beyond that, she seemed unable to focus. Years in the dark room had weakened her eyes, her gaze darting, not lingering on other people's faces. She would not look anyone in the eye, only glancing quickly defensively. The loss of control over her body was constant. She had never been taught normal bodily functions, only strapped to a commode where restraints replaced instruction. In the sterile environment of the hospital, this appeared not as resistance, but as evidence the absence of instruction during the most crucial, formative years. The staff who accompanied the family home described the scene that had created this situation: a bedroom with windows covered with foil light, completely blocked air stagnant. In one corner of the room was a narrow crib, its frame reinforced with chicken wire. Next to it was a commode with crude restraints. The room smelled of confinement, old bedding, unwashed clothes, and excrement. This was not a place to live, but a place to eliminate life. In this context, the girl's silence became the most obvious truth. She did not scream, did not cry, did not ask for food or water. Years of punishment for sound had rendered her almost completely mute. The few sounds that came out were only groans spoken cautiously, each cut off as if she were waiting for punishment. The silence was not an absence. It was a memory encoded in every movement. The doctors recorded the results in the neutral tones of medical literature, but what was clear was this was a child shaped by restrained darkness and silence. Her body was more than malnutrition. It was a forensic record of 13 years of deprivation. Deprivation of speech, freedom, and the most basic human interactions. As the doctors watched the realization spread through the group, this was not mere neglect, but a regime of deliberate deprivation, enforced discipline over more than a decade, and it was all discovered not by design, but by chance. Her survival had turned her body into evidence, her silence into testimony. The case had only just begun, but one truth was clear: to understand the girl, one had to read her body. Her body spoke when her voice could not, and what it told was more terrifying than words could describe. To understand the child, the first thing the investigators had to understand was the room. What they had entered was not a place of rest, but a design for absence. The windows were wrapped in foil, the seams sealed, not letting in any light. Even at noon, the room was dark. The air was still the kind of stillness that exists when all movement is forbidden. In that space, there were two central objects: a crib reinforced with chicken wire and a toilet seat with ropes. During the day, she was tied to the chair, her arms immobilized her body, not allowed to stand, not to stretch, not to explore. At night, she was moved into the crib. The wire was not protection but confinement, a cage in the form of a bed. The rhythm of her childhood was not measured by play or school, but by the transition from one form of bondage to another. Punishment not only shaped her behavior but also structured her environment, as if furniture and bonds together made up the world. Every sound, whether a cry, a call, or the involuntary exclamation of a child, was met with threats or violence. It was said that her father's voice would growl like a dog outside her door. At other times, a wooden stick would be smashed against her body, inculcating the lesson of silence in every movement. Noise invited pain. Silence became survival. The room did not allow for any normal human interaction. There were no toys, no books, no decorations. Even conversations outside the door were forbidden. Family members were instructed to whisper inside, lowering their voices to maintain the artificial silence imposed on the girl. What filtered into the room, if anything, was a faint whisper, a reminder that speech was permitted to others, but not to her. The deprivation went beyond language. With the window sealed, her eyes had never adjusted to the transition from day to night. Vision shrank to a range of about 12 feet, no more. Her nervous system, deprived of light, adjusted to the darkness as if it were natural. Even the sense of temperature became dull. The room did not alternate between hot and cold. It was a still environment where sensation itself was denied. The bondage was not only physical, but psychological. Homemade robes held her in place when chairs and crib were no longer effective. Tied, muted, placed in the dark, she was deprived of all the cues a child needs to form identity: language, movement, touch, and light. What she experienced was momentary and fleeting. A spoonful of liquid food in her mouth, the feel of the wire mesh under her hands, the pressure of the rope around her wrists. For 13 years, this room had stood in for the world. This was not casual neglect, born of poverty or neglect. This was an active erasure carried out consistently. Her development was not simply ignored, it was systematically suppressed. When the investigators documented the room, they did not describe a bedroom. They described an environment designed to stifle human development. Silence was not a byproduct, but a central tenet. It was imposed, enforced, and maintained at all costs. The father's hatred of sound became the architecture shaping the way windows were sealed, the way voices were lowered, the way the child was punished. In that silence, a childhood was not allowed to blossom. It was dismantled. When authorities photographed the room, the images captured only darkness, wire, and wood. But behind each bondage was a larger intention: to restrain, to erase, to ensure that the girl who lived there would never be seen or heard. The room was not built for comfort, not even for sleep. It was built for disappearance. The house on Golden West Avenue was dominated by one man's obsessions, and those obsessions had been building long before his children were born. Clark Y. entered the world in Oregon with a different name, Pearl. His early years were spent in rooms he would later describe only with bitterness: the brothels where his mother worked, where noise, conflict, and passers-by shaped his childhood. Those early experiences gave him not language, but suspicion. The boy drifted through the foster care system, learning that sound was always dangerous, that the voices of others were a sign of betrayal or exposure. When he finally became an adult, he abandoned the name Pearl, replacing it with Clark, as if erasing the source that might protect him from it. He built his identity not from family, but from distance. By adulthood, he was a mechanic in Los Angeles, stable on the outside, but still filled with old hatred. The center of his private life was the worship of his mother. He built a shrine in his home untouched by anyone. Everything was kept as relics, the space maintained in a state of perpetual mourning. When she died in a car accident in 1958, the loss seemed to make him more withdrawn. Her absence did not soften him but hardened him in silence. From that year on, he largely withdrew from the outside world. The family lived by his rules. The first rule: silence. Conversations were to be whispered in the house. Neighbors later recalled that they rarely heard a sound from behind those walls. Clark carried a gun even in his private room, resting it on his lap, as if to guard against an invisible threat. Paranoia became his companion, and silence was a condition of life. The architecture of the house reflected his obsession. The living room became the sleeping quarters for the rest of the family. Mattresses and blankets were spread on the floor, while the regular bedrooms were off limits. One room, a shrine to his mother, remained intact, a museum of mourning. Another was for his daughter Genie. But this was no bedroom in the traditional sense. It was a prison cell with tinfoil covering the windows and ropes shaping the interior. Clark's control was absolute. His wife, nearly blind from cataracts, lived according to his instructions. Their son John endured neglect mixed with violent reprimands. And Genie, born in 1957 after a difficult birth, became the focus of the harshest rules. As she grew older, She was isolated, as if Clark had decided that her existence should not spill over beyond the family. Silence was imposed upon her. Visitors were rare outsiders, almost never appeared. When someone approached, Clark positioned himself as a wall-threatening gun, always within reach. He trusted no one, relied on no community, and believed he had the right to isolate his family from the outside world. The initial suspicion turned into tyranny. The temple honored his mother. The prison held his daughter. The rest of the family existed in the narrow space between those two poles, adjusting their behavior to his moods, lowering their voices to his tolerance. Every aspect of Clark's power converged on a single idea: sound was the enemy. To eliminate it, he created a system where whispers replaced words, silence replaced laughter, punishment replaced any attempt to break the silence. In this environment, Genie's room became the most extreme expression of that obsession. This was not casual neglect, but the architecture of someone who wanted to eliminate sound. Clark's life left little trace in public records, but inside the house, he remade every corner into a testimony. One room honored the dead. One held the living captive. Between the two, the family was reduced to fear, moving silently under the weight of his presence. Over time, investigators learned what the children had always known. The real prison was not the chicken wire cage, but the man who demanded it. He built a shrine for his mother and a prison for his daughter. And in doing so, he ensured that silence became the only legacy the family could not escape. The Y house had been marked by absences long before the investigators opened the door. The pattern began with the children who did not live to grow up. Each loss solidified Clark's fears until silence became his only defense. The first daughter died before her memory formed a newborn abandoned to the cold and the needy. The official record read, "Abandoned," a word that was dry and cruel. The loss was acknowledged, processed, and left to history. But in the house, the absences lingered. Clark had shown signs of instability, and the death of a child gave him more reason to withdraw. The second child, a boy named Robert, died a short, stillborn death from sepsis, a disease that would have been treatable under normal circumstances, but which in this house, defined by neglect and secrecy, had become a death knell. Another coffin was laid down, a reminder that life within those walls could not last. For Clark, this was not a signal for change, but a reason to consolidate control. Each funeral plunged the family deeper into isolation. Only John, the eldest son, remained existing in the same silence. But unlike the infants, he was old enough to perceive and remember. He later described the house as a concentration camp, a word that transcended the individual, evoking the system of confinement. For John, existence meant being neglected, wandering within narrow confines, deprived of affection, wary of his father's violent hand. His presence was tolerated, never nurtured. He existed, but at the cost of alienation and lifelong scars. In 1957, another child was born, the girl who would become known as Genie. A difficult birth, possibly lacking oxygen and requiring blood transfusions in the early days. Her family may have seen her as fragile, a child in need of care. But to Clark, she was a symbol of all his worries, a figure he believed unfit for the ordinary world. Her frailty seemed to confirm his view that the outside world could not be trusted. She was not protected by openness, but by secrecy. The following year, a shock decided Clark's fragile stability. In 1958, his mother, to whom he had built a shrine, died in a car accident. The death stripped him of the one anchor he cherished above all else. The driver was given probation, a sentence Clark saw as an insult that continued to be tragic. The legal system had failed him as the world had failed him since childhood. From that moment on, his paranoia became permanent. After her death, Clark shut himself off from his neighbors, cut off all ties with his extended family, and turned his home into a closed system under his absolute control. His mother's shrine remained intact as if she had just left. The rest of the house was thick with silence rooms divided not for comfort, but for obedience. Each tragedy, a baby girl who died of cold, a son from infection, a mother from an accident, became a layer of stone around his psyche. Where others sought connection, he built walls. Where grief led to mourning, it gave birth to rules. The family learned quickly. Voices were lowered to whispers, windows were closed to block out the outside world. Every movement was restricted by his command. When the authorities moved in 1970, the house was no longer a mere dwelling. It had become a memorial to loss. Every absence was petrified into ritual. Clark's paranoia was sculpted by death. And in his determination to resist further loss, he imposed silence on every living member of the family. Death came early in the White House. Silence took over the rest. The house hardened, no longer a place for the living, but a mausoleum where the living were held. The Y family lived not by routine, but by command. Every action, every sound was governed by a set of rules, suffocating to the point of suffocation. These rules were not written down, nor were they spoken. They were maintained by fear, repetition, and punishment. And their focus was always on one thing: the elimination of sound. Near Genie's room, speech was forbidden. Members were warned never to speak within range of her door. If violated, Clark would be furious. Whispers were permitted, but only as a shadow of language, weak, restrained, stripped of warmth. As time passed, even outside her room, voices dropped to almost inaudible. The house had a strange atmosphere, not completely silent, but lowered in tone, as if every member had become accomplices in maintaining the silence. Genie grew up in a world devoid of conversation, where words never reached her ears as natural rhythms. Any noise she made was immediately punished. When she tried to cry or call, Clark growled outside the door like a dog, a sound designed to intimidate and discipline. At other times, he used a wooden stick hitting her body to punish her for making a sound. The lesson sank in. Making noise was inviting fear and pain. As time passed, she stopped trying. What remained were weak animal sounds, hesitant and often cut off. Her silence was not a lack of words, it was survival. Whispers outside the door, a roar in response from the hallway. The deprivation spread to all senses. Her vision contracted to near-range functioning only about 12 feet, beyond which the world faded into blur. In a normal child, vision expanded with experience tracking movement on the playground or the classroom. For Genie, vision contracted trained by the confines of a dark room and aluminum-blocked windows. Even the sense of temperature was numb. Without going outside, without experiencing the alternation of light and shade, she no longer knew hot or cold. The body existed in a static state, stripped of the cues that would help it learn to adapt. In a world stripped of variation, the sense of self withered. Food followed rules that stripped away meaning. Meals were not family gatherings, not moments of learning or conversation. Feeding was mechanical, quick, and silent. Her diet consisted mainly of baby food cereal and liquids. Occasionally, she was given a hard-boiled egg, but even then, eating was restricted. She had to eat quickly without spilling or making a sound. No forks, no knives, no family table. Just spoons, bowls, and the requirement for silent obedience. These routines ensured that every avenue of development language, play, sensory exploration was blocked. Language had never come, so she could not develop it. Vision was diminished. The world became close and small. Food was limited to textures that did not require chewing or tasting. Even emotions were starved. Laughter, crying, or complaining were all at risk of punishment. The house became not just a building, but a finely tuned instrument of silence, controlled by the father. For Clark, these rules were more than an obsession. They were control of the family, control of the memory of his own loss, control of the existence of sound. Every whisper, every roar, every punishment reinforced the boundaries he demanded. Each year of that condition pushed Genie deeper into silence, her body adapting to the narrow spaces that remained. The silence in Wise House was never accidental. It was imposed, designed, and maintained. It did not represent peace nor quiet for reflection. It was a weapon woven by a father to control the life around him. In the end, silence was not absence. It was control. When the police entered Wise House in November 1970, it took only a few minutes to see enough. The tin-foiled windows, the stench of confinement, the chicken wire cage, and the dirty commode confirmed what the hospital staff had suspected. This was not a dysfunctional or troubled family. It was a deliberate structure of confinement. Clark Y was arrested without ceremony. His authority crumbled under the sudden weight of the revelation. The story quickly made the front pages. A 13-year-old girl no more talkative than a newborn was discovered in a Los Angeles suburb. Reporters swarmed the courthouse. Newspapers ran pointed headlines: "Beast Child, Silent Girl, Secret Prisoner." The details were both haunting and intriguing. How could such a situation exist hidden behind the facade of modern normalcy? The public demanded explanations, and prosecutors prepared to charge both parents. In the courtroom, Irene Y appeared haggard, blind, dependent on others, her voice muffled by years of living under her husband's authority. Investigators noted her disabilities and her history of being controlled by Clark. Soon the case against her began to crumble. The charges were eventually dropped, the state recognizing her limitations and the oppressive atmosphere in which she lived. But for Clark, the evidence was overwhelming. A trial was scheduled, and on November 20th, 1970, when proceedings were scheduled to begin, Clark acted decisively to end things on her own terms. He was found dead with a shotgun, no doubt about it. On the floor beside him was a note, a final statement in the same tone that had imposed silence in the house. The world will never understand. It was not a confession, but a challenge, an assertion that the rules he had established were beyond the understanding of outsiders. Alongside this message were two other small notes. One was addressed to his surviving son John and contained $400. The gesture was akin to an offering, but it retained the cool terseness with which he had been a father. Not an apology, not a reconciliation, just a direction to proceed. The other note, short and mysterious, denied the coming trial. The world could not judge what it could not understand. His death ensured that judgment would never be spoken in a court of law. No testimony, no defense, no sentence. The man who imposed silence ensured that his own voice would never be questioned. The trial ended before it even began. Instead, all that remained was the evidence in the house, the daughter's medical records, and the fragmented memories of her surviving children. For Irene, the end of the charges did not mean freedom from scrutiny. Public opinion weighed heavily, questioning how a mother could live within the same walls without intervening. But the disability, the dependence, and the climate of fear created an image of a woman trapped in her husband's orbit. Legally, she was released. Morally, her role remained murky. The girl at the center of the case was placed under the protection of the state. She entered the world of hospital psychologists and newspapers not through a carefully planned rescue, but through an accident and its aftermath. Clark's death removed the possibility of testimony, but did not erase the trauma. It merely closed a chapter of control while the consequences remained. In the public record, Clark Y is remembered not for his life, but for his death. A mechanic, he changed his name, built a shrine and a prison in the same house, and believed that silence could protect him from knowledge. His final act extended that belief outward. By killing himself on the morning of his trial, he prevented the court from speaking for him. The man who imposed silence ensured that his final voice would never be heard in the courtroom. When Genie was taken into state custody, doctors and psychologists saw more than a victim of abuse. They saw a question that had long been debated but never tested under normal conditions. Can language be learned after the critical period of childhood has passed? In academia, it was still a hypothesis. In Genie, they believed they had found living, if painful, evidence of an opportunity. By 1971, the National Institute of Mental Health committed federal funding to study her development. For 4 years from 1971 to 1970, Genie's life was spent with researchers, therapists, and caregivers who wanted to answer questions that had never been tested on such a scale. This was, by all accounts, a case study born of circumstance one that no ethical framework could have intentionally created. The team of experts around her came from many different fields. David Rigler, a psychologist, oversaw much of her care, making her family home for long stretches of time. Susan Curtis, a linguist, tracked every word she learned and every phrase she struggled to form. James Kent, a pediatrician, monitored her health and emotional state. Jean Butler, one of her first teachers, put her in a structured environment outside of confinement. Jay Shirley, a sleep researcher, conducted neuroscientific studies examining her brain activity patterns. Each brought expertise, but together, they faced the challenge of caring for a child who was both patient and subject. The critical period hypothesis holds that if language is not learned in the early years, it will never be fully mastered. Grammar, the deep structure of human communication, needs early exposure to develop. Genie was a rare, terrifying case, a child deprived of language in her early years, now emerging as a teenager. Could she recover what had been taken away? Tests revealed an unusual neurological signature. An EEG recording her sleep showed abnormal spindle wave activity, the brain waves that help consolidate memories. Researchers debated whether this was a congenital defect or the result of long-term deprivation. The distinction was crucial. If the defect was biological, the environment only exacerbated it. If environmental, then confinement stunted development. The answer remained elusive. Day by day, she showed clues that kept the question alive. She learned vocabulary at an astonishing rate, picking up words for objects, actions, emotions. She could string them together into simple sentences: applesauce by store-bought milk, more outside. But grammar remained elusive. Syntax flickered, then disappeared. Speech remained as brief as text messages. She could think, imagine, and express herself clearly through gestures, but language as a system resisted her efforts. The scientific implications of this case are vast. To linguists, Genie seems to confirm the hypothesis that grammar is built into the early years. To psychologists, she demonstrates resilience in thought humor and nonverbal communication. But behind every discovery, there is always a sense of unease. This natural experiment was not created by design, but by cruelty. Treating it as data means remembering that at its core, it is a child's life. Research funding prolongs observation, but it also blurs the lines. Researchers live with her, teach her, measure her progress, and sometimes shape her future. She is both subject and protégé. Her happiness is tied to her career and scientific publications. Every step forward is shadowed by exploitation. In academic papers, her name is hidden, her identity protected. But in hospital rooms and homes, she was still a girl, smiling at small joys, holding the hands of caregivers, or retreating into silence when overwhelmed. For her, research was not an experiment, but everyday life. Genie's case revealed what no ethical framework could allow: the harsh contours of a critical period in a child's life. Knowledge was extracted from deprivation. Understanding was born from tragedy. The experiment should never have existed, and then it did. In the sterile hallways of Children's Hospital, Los Angeles, doctors waited silently for Genie. For weeks, she made only growling sounds and averted eyes. Then, during a routine checkup, she reached out to Dr. James Kent. As he tried to walk away, she held his finger and wouldn't let go. The gesture was small, almost instinctive, but it meant something. After years of being deprived of comfort, this was the first signal. Don't leave me. That moment marked the beginning of attachment behaviors, fragile but persistent attempts to connect with others. She began to gravitate toward familiar faces, watching them more patiently, holding her gaze a little longer. When left alone, she would reach out or make a soft sound, not in protest, but in a plea for presence. For the first time in her life, another human being represented safety, not threat. The progress extended to daily activities. Genie entered the hospital incontinent, her body accustomed to the confinement chair. With patient guidance, she learned to use the toilet, to recognize and respond to her body's signals. It was not automatic, each step required repetition, but gradually, she regained independence. The simple act of going to the bathroom, closing the door, and returning without help became a symbol of transformation. Dressing came next. At first, she struggled with fabric-twisted sleeves and jumbled shoes. But gradually she learned the order shirt, first sweater second. Socks, first shoes second. With encouragement, she dressed herself, each success recorded in her medical records as evidence of progress. What had been deprived for 13 years was now opened up in a matter of weeks when the opportunity was given. Bathing was another window. Water unfamiliar became a source of comfort. She learned to step into the tub, wash her body with help, and eventually manage independently. Cleanliness, long neglected, became a habit. Doctors noted the change carefully, but every detail reflected a part of her emerging humanity. Most notable laughter, startling at first, an echo where silence had filled the air. She laughed at small interactions, a toy, a funny face, a gentle tickle. The sounds were incomplete, uneven, but full of joy. For a child who had been punished for making noise, laughter became the first rebellion. Where a bark or a hit had silenced her, she now made free, even determined noises. Anger also appeared, but more safely. She raged, kicked, flailing her arms. But these were very different from her father's violence. They were controlled storms, expressions of frustration but not harm. Researchers saw them as significant evidence that she was beginning to channel her emotions rather than swallow them in silence. For Genie, even the defiance was progress. To outsiders, these advances might seem normal milestones for any child. But to those who witnessed her first day, slouching, silent, drooling, unable to care for herself, each step was a rebirth. Beneath the years of deprivation, there was the capacity to learn to connect, to reclaim the lives that had been taken away. What emerged was not a sudden transformation, but a gradual unfolding. A girl who had been locked in silence began to mark her presence with gestures, glances, voices, attachments, independence, and expressions. Each came in fragile, hesitant, but unmistakably human. In this new soundscape, laughter rang out loudest. Once forbidden, it became her first act of rebellion, proof that silence could not hold her back. When Genie first entered the program, she had no language. Years of silence had almost rendered her mute, her voice a mere sound. But within a few months, researchers witnessed something extraordinary. She began to learn words, objects, actions, emotions that had never been named suddenly appeared in her consciousness with astonishing speed. Her vocabulary expanded, each word held with intensity, as if storing fragments of the world that had been taken away from her. She could point to objects and name them: dog, cup, mother. She developed simple signs to supplement her speech, combining gestures and sounds to be understood. When shown a series of pictures, she tried to order them, telling primitive stories. A boy climbs, a boy falls, a boy cries. Stories were not fluent, but she recognized the sequence of events, knowing that one moment led to another. Perceptual testing revealed abilities that had long been hidden. She grasped the concept of object permanence, things that exist even when they are not seen. When a toy was hidden under a towel, she searched for it, refusing to accept its disappearance. She imitated actions after a delay, reproducing gestures she had observed a few minutes earlier. The abilities Genie displayed proved that her mind had never been wiped clean. It had simply waited silently in the silence that had lasted for years. Curiosity became the driving force, leading her to explore each space with her hands and eyes, to run her fingers over things, to arrange blocks into towers, to break them down and rebuild them. She traced shapes, answered puzzles, and her nonverbal intelligence often exceeded expectations, suggesting abilities that her limited speech had never shown. Researchers saw in her a child eager to participate, eager to understand the world that had suddenly opened up before her. And yet, one barrier remained inexorable. Grammar, the framework of language, resisted her efforts. She learned words, but not rules. She connected 2 or 3 words into sentences, but the results were fragments, empty, unconnected. Applesauce by store. Want milk. More outside. Each phrase had meaning, but no structure. It seemed that words lived alone in her mind, unable to be connected to sentences. This haunted researchers. Language was more than labels. It was systems, patterns, relationships. Genie seemed to confirm the hypothesis that grammar, unlike vocabulary, must be learned in the early years. After a critical point, words might accumulate, but the deep structure of syntax would never crystallize. Her history emerged in her speech in fractured ways. When she tried to tell about abuses, the phrases came out rough and uncoordinated. Father hit, bad cry. The thought was present, but its form was not expressed. The line between memory and language blurred so that she could only tell the story in fragments. To the observer, the paradox became clear. Genie could imagine, imitate, create. She solved puzzles, remembered sequences, laughed at jokes, and expressed desires. But without grammar, thought is stunted, communicated only in fragments of meaning. Other children string words together into stories. She merely arranges them into lists. The surface is rich, the foundation is lacking. In academic papers, her progress has been both celebrated and mourned. She demonstrated that vocabulary and curiosity can develop even after extreme deprivation. She demonstrated intelligence and resilience, but also showed that one-element syntax is bound by time. The brain's window for grammar has closed and no amount of effort can reopen it. Her phrases still haunt researchers, not because of what they say, but because of what they lack. Applesauce by store. Want milk. More outside. They are signals, not sentences. Each phrase carries meaning without structure, thought without syntax. And that limit, both haunting and rigid, defined the boundaries of what Genie could recover from and what she would never recover from. In the first months after her discovery, Genie lived in a hospital, observed, tested, and recorded. But soon researchers faced another question: where was her home? The answer led her to a series of homes where care and research collided. Each placement was a compromise between nurturing and investigation. The first was the home of Gene Butler, a teacher at Children's Hospital who believed he could provide stability for Genie. Butler created an environment that was meant to be protective, but his approach quickly raised concerns. He limited Genie's contact with the wider research team, cutting her off from many sources of stimulation. Care came with control. Protection came with possession. When Butler sought permanent custody, his request was denied. The court and colleagues recognized the conflict. A child was both the subject of research and the prize of professional rivalry. The Butler experiment ended, but the question remained unresolved. Then David Rigler, a psychologist in the group, and his wife Marilyn took Genie into their home. The arrangement was both familial and professional. Rigler was funded to observe her development while acting as a foster parent. The line between research and family became even more blurred. In the Rigler household, Genie experienced what was close to normal life. She went to school, followed routines, and integrated into the family rhythm. She laughed a lot, her joy recorded in notes and memoirs. Once a neighbor boy gave her a toy fire truck. She grabbed it with unexpected joy, repeating the phrase, "Genie happy." For a child who had never had toys, gifts, or possessions, that moment was a discovery of new connections, play, and communication. The family brought her joy and affection. She formed attachments to both David and Marilyn attended family meals and adapted to the presence of children her own age. But the environment was also filled with expectations. Every gesture, every word, every tantrum was observed not just as a parental challenge, but as data. In the evenings, she was the daughter. In the mornings, she was the subject of research. In her diaries and reports, the two roles were inseparable. Meanwhile, Irene Y. underwent cataract surgery. With her vision partially restored, she sought to reconnect with her daughter. Visits were arranged, but always tense. The research team was suspicious of Irene, uncertain of her influence, while Irene felt excluded from her daughter's life by people who saw her less as a mother and more as a research variable. The tension between family and researcher grew, eroding trust. In these homes, the central conflict becomes acute. Who is Genie to those around her? For Butler, she is a dependent who needs to be protected from outside hands. For Wriggler, she is both child and research subject embedded in family life, but measured by hypothesis. For Irene, she remains a daughter, though she is powerless to protect her. In every aspect, care and research intertwine, raising questions that no one can fully answer. For Genie, the experience brings moments of happiness, a sense of belonging. But even in that laughter, the shadow of research is present. Each home is both protective and custodial. Affection is mixed with observation. Her progress is recorded not only in memories, but also in files, graphs, and reports. When the caregiver becomes the researcher who protects the child, in Genie's case, the answer is never clear. She finds in these homes fragile joy, temporary normalcy, and the difficult balance of seeing two things at once: the eyes of her parents and the eyes of science. For 4 years, Genie's life had been chronicled in tests, diaries, and daily observations. Progress was measured. Failures were recorded. Her life ran on the clock of a federally funded study. But grants, like all resources, had limits. In 1975, the National Institute of Mental Health withdrew its funding. The door to science closed not with a conclusion but with an expiration date. The study was over. The girl remained. The withdrawal had immediate consequences. There was no longer a research framework, no structure to sustain care. Genie was returned to her mother Irene, who had recently undergone cataract surgery and had partially regained her sight. Irene had been legally exonerated years earlier, but her ability to parent was still affected. She had lived under Clark's control for decades, coming out into the world, damaged, dependent, and unprepared to care for a child with special needs. Initially, the return was seen as a chance for reunion, a chance to mend family ties. But in reality, it marked the collapse of the fragile protections that had surrounded Genie. Without institutional support, Irene struggled to meet her daughter's needs. Her education was disrupted, her therapy was reduced, and her daily life became a series of days spent simply surviving. The progress that had been built in a carefully structured environment began to disintegrate without steady guidance. By 1979, the conflict had escalated into court. Irene filed a lawsuit against the research team and the institutions involved, accusing them of exploiting her daughter. She argued that those who had promised to study and protect Genie had instead turned her into a tool for their own professional ambitions, putting data above their own well-being. The lawsuit highlighted an inconvenient truth. The line between care and research had never been clear, and when funding ended, It collapsed completely. The legal process dragged on for years. The researchers argued that their work was necessary and that Genie's exposure to science also provided opportunities for growth. Irene maintained that her daughter had been objectified, her life consumed by research rather than protected. In 1984, the case was settled out of court. No one was held responsible, and no verdict was reached, but the result was decisive. Genie's connection to the research team was permanently severed. From that moment on, the once internationally influenced girl fell into obscurity. Gone were the structured routines, the detailed daily progress logs, the visuals of her breakthroughs. The institutions that had debated the ethics of research were no longer responsible for her care. She drifted through the system, moving from one place to another, with only fragments of progress remaining. The story of the lawsuit was not one of victory or defeat, but of disintegration. The scientists lost their subjects, the mother lost the lawsuit, and Genie lost the fragile support network that had kept her grounded. When the study ended, there was no frame to hold together her fractured world. The consequences were ironic. The child who had been silenced for 13 years had become the most studied person in the field of linguistics. Then, when the funding ended, she was silenced again, not by chains or threats, but by neglect. The place that had watched her so closely now hardly cared. The research clock stopped, but life did not stop. And without the research scaffolding, there was nothing to protect her from collapse. After the study ended, Genie was placed in a foster home. The initial hopes soon gave way to a repetition of the very things she had escaped. The structures that had nurtured fragile progress, study routines, therapeutic support, and daily care gave way to families imposing discipline without understanding. One of the foster homes was described by witnesses as militaristic. The environment was strict, punitive, and intolerant of weakness. Genie, who had relied on patience and gentleness to thrive, was punished for behaviors that were beyond her control. When she vomited a physiological response to stress, she was beaten. Food was restricted, meals were reduced, and the fragile body that had begun to heal returned to a state of malnutrition. The consequences were stark and devastating. Silence, once her prison, became her only refuge. Genie stopped talking. Where she had once pointed, gestured, and named things, she retreated into silence. The fragile vocabulary built up over years of therapy was slowly eroded. All that remained was fear. Fear of making a sound, fear of opening her mouth, fear of inviting punishment. The laughter that had been recorded at the Wriggler home was gone. A girl was reported to be withdrawn, holding her body tense. Her lips pressed together, her eyes averted. The reluctance to speak was no longer a trace of her father's cruelty, but the result of new environments that repeated the same patterns. Years of progress collapsed in a matter of months. What had been painstakingly built was fragile, crumbling under the neglect and abuse. Genie was hospitalized. She was cared for malnutrition. Her body once again failing to meet basic health standards. Medical notes described her as withdrawn, silent, resisting eye contact. The medical language was dry, but the reality was brutal. A child who had reached out, smiled at toys, and built towers of blocks was now afraid to open her mouth. From the hospital, she was transferred to state facilities where care was more supervised than developmental. These facilities were designed to manage, not nurture. The atmosphere was orderly, but impersonal. Staff changed shifts, ended shifts, and relationships were fleeting. For a girl just learning to trust this instability drove her further into herself. J. Shirley, the sleep researcher who had monitored her brain activity, visited in later years. His assessment was bleak. He noted withdrawal silence and withdrawal from the world. The curiosity that had driven her to explore had been extinguished. The glimmer of progress that researchers had once seen in her progress had now dimmed, perhaps permanently. At this point, the question was no longer whether Genie would master grammar, but whether she could regain even the small victories she had once achieved. The answer seems obvious. What had been built with extraordinary care was dismantled by ordinary cruelty. Foster families and state institutions had, in their own ways, succeeded in restoring silence. The tragedy of the second failure lies in the very contrast with the first. The prison Clark Lee created was intentional, a system designed to erase the girl's humanity. Foster families did not intend it, but the results were frighteningly similar. Neglect, punishment, and abandonment achieved what chains and silence had done. Progress can die faster than it is built. The language that had begun to form the laughter that once echoed in the Wriggler house, the fragile independence of toileting and dressing, all could be erased, and once erased, the chance for restoration faded as the years passed. The second failure was not being locked in a dark room. It was the return of silence to a world that had every chance of stopping it. When investigators first questioned John Y., the eldest surviving son, his words were uncompromising. He described his childhood home as a concentration camp. Not a gentle metaphor, but the testimony of someone who had lived under the rule of silence, fear, and control. He survived, but survival did not bring freedom. John's adulthood was a long struggle to climb out of those walls. He struggled with addiction, turned to substances that numbed his memories. An estrangement arose, a gap opened between him and his family, between him and the possibility of stability. At times, he leaned on faith, finding order where his father had left chaos. But even faith could not erase what had been written in his early years. The legacy of his captivity followed him until his death in 2011. The boy who slept on the living room floor, suffering the neglect of his sister, kept in the dark, never fully free. Their mother, Irene, outlived him, but not with the same clarity. After Clark's suicide, she remained on the sidelines of her daughter's story, present but diminished. Cataract surgery gave her some vision, but the years of Clark's domination left a permanent mark. She never regained her power as a mother, never ensured her daughter's care, never outlived the image of a woman who was both complicit and controlled. In 2003, Irene died, closing a life of trauma dependence and tragedy. What remained was Genie, the silent center of the family story. After the collapse of the foster care, she disappeared from public view. Court orders sealed her identity. Her movements were tracked only through the most discreet notes. By 2008, she was reportedly living in an assisted care facility in Southern California. The location was not disclosed. Staff stressed confidentiality, and no photos were released. Once the subject of headlines around the world, the feral girl who had amazed researchers and the public was now a shadowy figure known only to a few caregivers behind closed doors. The family, if it could be called that, had been shattered. Clark ended his life before the trial, leaving a note that read, "The world will never understand." Irene, blind and dependent, was unable to intervene. John the witness, who named the childhood home, fell into addiction and died alone. And Genie, discovered by accident, studied as a specimen, failed to be cared for, still exists somewhere. Her current status is unknown, her voice lost once more. Survival has become an empty word. Surviving captivity, surviving research, surviving from facility to facility. But it is not living. Each family member survives in time but is broken in essence. The story does not end with resolution. Only quiet endings, leaving more questions than answers. The case once promised to bring understanding of language of resilience of what is taken from a child. But traced back through the family's lives, the answers offer little comfort. Knowledge is gained, but lives are broken. No one within those walls escapes unscathed. A brother calls his childhood a concentration camp and spends his life climbing out of it. A mother regains her sight, but not her daughter. And the girl at the center of it all is last known to exist in silence. Her place is sealed, her life reduced to rumor. To survive is not to live. Before her imprisonment, Genie's medical records show that she had been a normal child. There was no sign of a neurological disorder, no diagnosis that would have prevented her from following a normal path. In her early months, she followed the same trajectory as many children. Meaningless sounds, syllables falling into language. Then the door closed, the window sealed, silence imposed. When she was discovered, researchers hoped to see if the lost potential could be recovered. The results were frightening. Vocabulary increased. She could name objects, emotions, and desires. Thinking was not absent. She understood existence, cause and effect, humor and frustration. But grammar resisted. Sentence structure never took root. No matter how many words she gathered, the order to connect them eluded her. Applesauce by store. Want milk. More outside. The critical period hypothesis grammar must be learned in the early years or never was tragically confirmed. Genie became a rare but painful example that some capacities cannot be recaptured once the window is closed. Thinking in a parallel is more persistent. Intelligence manifests itself in puzzles, spatial tasks, and wordless play. She can imagine, perceive, and remember, but her ungrammatical thinking remains trapped, unformed, unable to translate into full stories. For science, the lesson is clear. For Genie, it is tragic. She carries knowledge that cannot be fully communicated, memories that cannot tell their own stories. What researchers record as data for her is a boundary she can never cross. The accusation goes beyond the father who creates silence. Clark Y failed, first building a prison of rope and aluminum foil, punishing noise until silence became a way of life. But he was not the only one who failed. When she was discovered, she became a hostage to a system that was not ready to separate research and care. The first collapse came when funding ended, leaving her adrift without a protective frame. The second collapse came from the foster care system, where punishment and neglect destroy progress more effectively than any experiment. By the time she disappeared into the support system, her fate had been sealed, not by nature, but by repetition. Her parents had failed, and when the opportunity for rescue came, the institutions had failed again. The case left behind is still studied, articles, films, and documents analyzing what her life reveals about the language of the brain. But the person at the center remains unknowable. The present is hidden. The voice is muted this time, not by bonds, but by time. In the end, the question is no longer what science has learned, but the price. Knowledge comes at the cost of a life, not lived a childhood, never had a woman who lost her voice. The answer is etched in silence as the world turns away. The cold truth Genie shows how much a child can endure. She survives isolation, confinement, and silence. She survives the weight of the watching eyes and the indifference of systems meant to protect. But she also shows the other side of survival. What is lost forever? Some abilities survive, others don't. And the ultimate question remains, how much can a child endure? And what is lost forever?